Okay, it's 2:01, so we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Mantech's Manufacturing Matters series. I'm Leanne Wilson, Mantech's Director of Marketing and Business Development. This series was created to focus on issues facing manufacturers to provide insights and takeaways. Certainly today's session hopefully should have several of those. We're going to discuss what manufacturers can do now to position leadership, communication, and planning. We have three industry experts with us today, Bruce Nielsen, Jennifer Peterson, and Wilbur Wolf. Each are going to have 15 minutes to cover their specific topic, and then we will open it up for a question and answer period. We are recording today's session. If that is of any concern to you, please use the chat function for the Q&A section. You can direct message me on the Mantech/Leanne Wilson for any questions that you want to ask during the chat feature. For now, all of you are turned off on your audio. During that Q&A part, we can encourage you to turn your audio on and ask direct questions as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Bruce.
Okay, thank you, Leanne, and welcome to today's webinar. Just a brief introduction. Again, my name is Bruce Nielsen. I'm a management consultant based here in central Pennsylvania. I'm originally from the Boston area, which you'll be able to tell as I speak. I have over 30 years experience working with Mantech to help manufacturing companies, including some of those attending today's webinar. Our focus is on helping our clients set and reach their goals through sound planning and strategy. And we're currently working with Mantech to offer business continuity planning to manufacturers to get through these difficult times and to be ready for the future. So please let us know if you would like to know more about business continuity. For the next few minutes, I want us to consider what it takes to provide good leadership to your team during a crisis. I'll share some principles I've learned and also a few stories from working with all kinds of clients over the years. I'd first like us to consider some current realities about the pandemic before we take a look at the 9 leadership tactics. Next slide. As we all know, we're living in unprecedented times that will forever alter our daily lives. This will be a huge market in human history, much like 9/11 was, or World War II. Some have even referred to it or suggested we'll be saying BC, before coronavirus. The virus has, of course, abruptly reminded us that we are all vulnerable in many ways, not only physically, but also emotionally and financially. And of course, we're all trying to practice social distancing and self-isolation, which are necessary now, but not really good for us long term. The next point about the US economy is one that is still unknown, with lots of data, as you know, coming in daily. But some have already said that the US economy, the outlook will be bleak for 2020, but fourth quarter and 2021 could see a record rebound. Although, as some of you know, they're now suggesting that some industries, and I think in particular the airlines, will likely take several years to fully recover. Sadly, millions of businesses and jobs will be gone, but new ones will also emerge. When people feel vulnerable and uncertain, as many do now, they are more receptive, and they expect their leaders to take charge and provide timely information and direction. Which leads to this question: how will we lead our teams through this when we ourselves still have questions? Whenever there is a crisis, we see some leaders who are very adept at handling the situation, while other leaders seem to make matters worse. Whether your shop is currently closed, partially open, or in full swing, I'd like to offer to you today 9 tactics that great leaders are doing now to get their teams through the crisis. The first one, as you can see, is maintaining a small group of key advisors. Most crises are sudden and unexpected events, and good leaders already have in place a small group of advisors they can quickly access to advise them on the scope of the crisis, identify critical next steps, and help prepare the right message to both internal and external audiences. I know some joining us today have already in place a small group of such advisors, whether that group is made up of internal folks or external advisors, or perhaps a combination of the two. And in the past, I've helped some companies set up an advisory board comprised of people with just the right expertise, who are also willing to be candid with the owner, who can be trusted to maintain the confidentiality of sensitive information. The second point, stay highly visible and accessible. People need to know, people need to see and hear from their leaders soon after a crisis event occurs to reassure them that they are aware of what is happening and that they are prepared to lead people through it. Even though all the facts may not yet be known and the path forward may be uncertain, hearing from a leader as soon as possible can be reassuring, giving people a sense of confidence and help reduce fear and rumors, which is especially important in the early stages of a crisis. Now, it's admittedly harder now to be highly visible with so many people working remotely and social distancing. However, you can still be visible by regularly calling or messaging people or even holding virtual meetings. It's also important for people to know how to reach you or a designated point of contact with their questions and concerns. The third point, be steady and measured. People need their leaders to address them in a calm and steady manner, avoiding extreme emotions or a tone of voice that comes across as excessively nervous and panic-stricken, or on one extreme, or glib and lighthearted on the other extreme. For example, making jokes to try and lighten the mood could be interpreted as insensitive and in poor taste. Now, if you don't feel you are able to be calm and steady in a given situation, you might want to ask someone else from your team who is good at doing this and is well known and respected, who might even read a prepared statement from you and provide other important information. The fourth point is be realistic and honest. Leaders need to state the facts as they know them and be clear about what they can do and not promise what is still unknown and beyond their control. Providing premature or false guarantees, such as everything will be back to normal soon, or nobody is going to take a pay cut or lose their job, that may be what everyone wants to hear, but it can give people false hopes and lead to distrust and resentment later. For example, if you've recently had to furlough or lay off some employees, or perhaps do both, be sure to let them know exactly what their status means and if they should apply for unemployment, especially if you don't know if or when you'll be able to call them back to work. The fifth point is to acknowledge feelings. Providing facts and data is extremely important, but people also benefit from some insight into what their leaders may be feeling, such as saying things like, "I know this is hard for all of us." And it's important for people to sense that their leaders recognize how the crisis may be affecting them. Some leaders might say, "I know that some of you are really struggling with what has happened." Acknowledging feelings and even expressing some heartfelt emotions can help to validate how others feel and also lets their people know that their leader gets it and can empathize with them. This past Christmas, the owner of a business who I'd worked with for many years, who often seemed larger than life, tragically died after a brief bout with cancer. At the company's annual planning meeting in January, his son agreed it would be important to start the meeting by first giving everyone a chance to talk about his dad and what he meant to them personally before we got down to business. Taking time to do this and giving them permission helped to ease an awkward moment. It turns out people were eager to talk about what the owner had meant to them and shared some stories and even a few tears. Afterwards, everyone seemed to realize just how cathartic it was to commemorate the owner in this way, and also realized how much it helped the family to hear such tributes to their loved one. Point number 6, when we talk about 9 tactics, I think that's coming up on the next slide, is to take action. Leaders who take some immediate and visible action during a crisis, consistent with what they say, are seen as more effective and competent than those whose actions are delayed, unrelated to the crisis, or do not match their words. People want to see their leaders in action and doing something. For example, visiting Ground Zero to see for themselves and talking with victims, or perhaps helping to fill sandbags during a flood, even if it's largely symbolic or to set an example for others. I know, for example, of a CEO of at a healthcare facility who recently was observed quietly helping out in the laundry room because they were overworked and short-staffed due to the pandemic. And in the news recently, the other day, I heard the plant manager at Ford Motor Company announcing that Ford is now making PPE, personal protective equipment, instead of cars and trucks. He proudly said, we were able to go from discussion to production in just 3 weeks. In other words, he went from just talking about it to doing something about it. My 7th point is to give clear and simple instructions. What do people need to start doing or perhaps stop doing as a result of the crisis? Good leaders provide clear and simple instructions, especially if the crisis will require a change in their normal routine or mandate a new policy or procedure, such as increased safety and security protocols. Recommending that everyone practice social distancing and self-quarantine are 2 specific examples we're all familiar with. It's also important that the leader let people know who they can contact if they have questions and the best way to reach them. Here might be an example of a clear message. We're closed until May 8th, and no one is allowed to enter the plant or the office until the following Monday, when everyone should report back to work or let their supervisor know if they can't. And this might be an example of an unclear message. Only essential employees need to report to work during the pandemic. My question would be, does everyone know who's essential? And even if they do, what does that say about the rest of us? Point number 8, explain what others can do to help. Most crises require a team effort to get through it, and it's unrealistic for people to expect their leaders to solve it alone. Good leaders let their people know what they can do to take care of themselves as well as help others get through the crisis. Perhaps it's donating blood or food or making homemade masks, which helps to spread the workload and also can be very cathartic for those affected to know they are contributing in a meaningful way. For example, I know some companies have been asking employees to volunteer to change their work schedule and do a different job to help where most needed. Or asking employees if any of them want to help at the local food bank by donating food or money, especially if your company is getting involved in that effort. And I know of one local manufacturer who recently switched over their production line to start making masks. This inspired some of their other employees to start experimenting with the company's 3D printers to see what else they could do to help out. Within a short time, they had figured out how to print plastic splitters, which are a key component used in ventilators that allow multiple patients to be able to share one ventilator. Pretty cool stories. And my final point, provide frequent communications and updates. Good leaders understand the importance of keeping people informed throughout a crisis as conditions change and new facts become known. They also carefully document their decisions, including any new policies, for future reference and for the benefit of anyone who might have missed the live sessions. I know some companies are now holding weekly virtual staff meetings with their team and holding town hall meetings with all their employees. Others are posting updates on their company intranet for employees or in some cases on their website for customers, and using both print as well as video recordings. The bottom line is, good leaders find ways to still communicate with others, even when they can't meet in person. And so if we go to the next slide here, there's just one question I'd like to ask all of you to consider today. The question is, how many of these 9 tactics am I already using, and which ones do I need to adopt to provide greater leadership to my team? I believe using these 9 tactics could be the difference between just surviving and thriving, and allow your team to look back someday and say that your leadership helped everyone get through a very difficult time. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Next up is Jennifer.
Hi. Actually, Bruce gave me the perfect launching point for some of my discussion today. Thank you, Bruce. My name is Jennifer Peterson. I am president of Wavelength Marketing, located here in Lancaster. We've been a QSP for Mantech for about 13 years now, helping both Mantech with their communications as well as many of their manufacturing clients. And I really like the fact that what Bruce focused on was not just about surviving, but thriving in the future. When Leanne and I were talking about the content of this particular section of today, we started talking about crisis communication. That was 3 weeks ago. Today we're talking about more about pausing and looking forward to a more stable future. So, Nora, if you want to advance, please. Thank you. So we like to say that agility creates opportunity, and really what we're helping our clients understand today is that making the right communications moves internally and externally, as well as the strategic decisions, can help position them for strength as they move forward. A lot of people are saying, where are we right now? Are we still in crisis? We're basically saying that we're at a point where we're at a pause. It's not stable, but we have enough of a floor underneath us right now that we can really take stock. And what we're telling our clients to do is to look forward, to put together stable communications plans for 3, 6, 9, and even 12 months. And once they have that framed up, then going back and putting a crisis communications plan in place for future, rather than doing the 72-hour, 48-hour, 5-day plan that so many of us have been in. I've been in marketing for 30 years. We've never seen anything like this, not even in the post 9/11. We had a client change their plans 8 times in one day. You just couldn't be prepared enough. And so we don't really want people looking at the next 5 days. We want them looking more stably forward and then going back to be prepared. So we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So, Nora. The first thing we really want to orient people is to not so much look at what situation we're in, but that we are talking to people. We're not communicating about what's happening. We have to really look at people, not customers, clients, buyers, vendors, employees, but people. And many manufacturers have been working with customer-centric marketing, which has been around for decades. It can be very difficult to do, but we want to push people into more human-centric marketing, where we're thinking about what motivates people, whether they're buying plastics parts or a machine shop. We're all people fundamentally, and we have changed dramatically as a result of what has happened recently. What people are looking for in all of their communication, be they your customers or your employees or your partners, are stability, reliability, and confidence. But they're also looking for honest connections. And I think we are not counseling our clients to be saying, we're here for you, we're in it together anymore. That's a saturated message at this point. It's kind of like banner blindness, back in the days when banner ads were so popular, they were very effective, and then we all became blind to them. Those are the types of messages that are really being overlooked at this point. People are looking for honest connections. They need to understand that what you bring to them, and you understand where they are right now in their decision-making processes and in their needs. So when you achieve that relevance, you have a greater chance of increasing engagement. And loyalty is all about the name of the game right now. It's about firming up your relationship with people, and you can only do that by demonstrating that you know them, you understand them, and that you can connect to them authentically. So communicate with confidence. That means stop and make a plan. It's about gaining control at this point. It's been very slippery. I can't imagine there's been a single person who did not find this to be constantly shifting and difficult to keep up with. So now is the perfect time to gain control. And we want people to stop, to think, and to make a plan. And when we say stop, it's about thinking, what do I actually need to say? This is a time when we can accidentally either under communicate or we can over communicate. And it's really important to analyze what actually needs to be said and to think about who actually needs to hear what we have to say. Is it appropriate to increase your communications with infrequent clients, or who really needs to be hearing what has to be said? And plan how they need to hear it, how often, what medium. Bruce did a great job of touching on some different ways that people are making connections today. Believe it or not, more industries, more people are reaching out with phone calls, even though people might be working remotely. People are going back to phone. They're going back to different ways of communication because, frankly, we're all hungry for that. I actually thanked a woman for conversation in the grocery store last week, and we were just talking about Clorox wipes. So people actually want outreach and connection. Nora. Thank you. Real quick, take a look at the near-term communications. Probably most of us are getting ready to communicate about our reopening. If you haven't yet, you will be very soon. Even if you're already open, a lot of people don't know who's open, and they don't know what the status are of the people that they're working with. So what we want you to communicate is what has been implemented to ensure a smooth transition. Be very specific. And this is not about just the face masks and your safety protocols and what you're doing for your people or for your clients, but what have you done to shore up your supply chain? Have you diversified where you're getting your materials? Have you shored up things? If you have lead times, how has that changed? What are you doing specifically to ensure smooth transition? How do you plan to conduct business? Have you taken things online? Are you doing no contact service calls? What exactly have you done? And if possible, communicate how you plan to remain stable. And that has a lot to do with the lead times and the supply chain and the relationships you've built throughout your entire organization. Separately, we want you to look at how you plan to support your employees from a communication standpoint. And again, Bruce really touched on this as well. If you don't have an internal communications plan, now's the time to develop one, even if it's very short term. If that's a weekly email that progresses to bi-weekly or to a monthly communications. We have a lot of clients who use private Facebook pages where they can push out different kinds of messages and encourage engagement. We do have clients who use anonymous communication mechanisms to really encourage two-way communication. They may often use a third-party off-site person to take certain types of questions that they can then feed back into the organization to allow for really honest two-way communication. But looking forward, now is the perfect time to be strategic. I know that everybody's been working so hard at figuring out where they stand, how they're going to keep their employees, how they keep their doors open, but it is an excellent time to be strategic. Think in phases, today, tomorrow, the 3 months, the 6 months, the 12 months, and map out a plan. It can be really anti-intuitive to think about what my brand is today, but it's exactly what needs to be done. We want you to start internally and think about yourselves. What have you changed and how have you changed? What's stronger? Have you taken processes online? Have you added new processes, streamlined? Where are you weaker though? What have you lost? What have you given up? Some companies need to take a hard look at diversification. If you have found yourself taking a harder hit than you wanted to because you couldn't diversify across multiple markets, a lot of companies will take this time to engage in some research to identify new revenue opportunities for themselves. Your buyers have changed, but how specifically? Your salespeople, your feet on the street can be an excellent way of finding out how buyers have changed. And if you don't know the answer, then you need to put in some sort of informal research process where you're figuring out how people want to do business now and what their priorities are now and moving forward. And the competitors, there's really no better time than now to do a competitive assessment. And we'll talk about that in a couple minutes here. So consider an actual formal branding exercise. We don't believe that a single brand should come out of this without having taken a serious look at who they are, what their relevance is to the people they're marketing to, the people they're having relationships with, and their competitors. This is the time to do that, because you can find yourself in a new position, in a better position. So, with behavior having changed, priorities certainly have changed. Why people are making decisions and what they're choosing have absolutely changed. And most of us here on this line are manufacturing and B2B, but there's still going to be spending happening. People are just going to prioritize how they spend. And now do I think there's a boom coming? I do think there's a boom coming, but when it's coming is questionable. But we have to be prepared to have to be the brand that's there, that's relevant, that has the connection. When competitors change, as we've noted here, very often equates to opportunity. That doesn't mean that some of our competitor brands have gone out of business. That's not something that we hope for. What it means is some of them may have diversified. Some of them may have found strengths in other industries and other applications that no longer make them a direct competitor for you. Or they've changed the way they do business or how they relate to the people that you were sharing as clients. And so if you can identify those changes and how you come out stronger, you definitely have more opportunity in front of you. From a marketing perspective, this is a time when people look and they either want to stop their budget or rework their budget. Very understandable. What we counsel people to do is to make smart, data-driven decisions when it comes to changing their budget. And that is asking for and insisting on the data of where you're getting your best results, what's working, what isn't working. Don't use your gut in this instance. Get the information that you need. Marketing attribution is extremely important right now. So you need to be able to track back where your results came from to the initiatives that you had in place and use that information. But you also have to have an understanding of how people are buying and engaging right now so that you're making an informed decision. Now that you've got a plan mapped out, this is when we tell people at this point where we are in this current crisis situation, now that you've got the future mapped and you're ready to communicate with confidence, do go back and put together your formal crisis communications plan. If you were caught flat-footed, if you didn't have it, we really want people to be spending time looking forward, growing forward, but making sure that when the next crisis comes, they are able to do so. They have the processes in place, the messages in place roughly for whatever the crisis might be, and then move forward. We've also added here, excuse me, to tap into marketing tactics that are working with people today. People are at home, people are absorbing more content. There's been a rush towards social media, a rush towards SEO and things like that, all of which were extremely effective. But what we would tell people to do is to focus on the high value content, not a glut of social, not a glut of SEO, but really that the white paper content, the actionable content, information that's supportive, that guides people, that differentiates you, that is useful, is the type of information you should be focused on putting out right now. And real quickly, focusing on growing forward, not going forward. At some point, hopefully now is the time you're thinking about growing. And if it's not, it's very near term. Things that we find to be successful and that we're making recommendations and working with our clients on are very simply reaching out to former clients. Dormant and inactive clients are a great small place to start if small and reasonable is what you're thinking about. We tend to get really good results whenever we have brands reach out, re-solidify themselves, open up the dialogue again. If your competitors have had a shift, you may find that people need a supplier. Use market research to identify new markets for existing strengths. So you're not reinventing yourself, but you may find that there are other complementary or even emerging markets or markets that are changing that are appropriate for what you offer. Nurturing prospects to fill the future pipeline is highly recommended at this time. Many of us remember that day when the pipeline was empty, and that's when we panic and we got to get stuff in and we engage in that rush marketing. We need something tomorrow. This is the perfect time to think about tomorrow. And if you're going to scale back on marketing and you have something you want to do, prospect nurturing is the thing to do. So automation is a great way to handle this because it doesn't require the effort of your salespeople, or automation can be used if your staff is really scaled back. But keeping those people moving through so that when you do come out of it, you've got qualified prospects there that are ready to close. Research, realign, and rebrand. Know who you are, know who you're talking to, what motivates them. Make sure you're completely aligned with the buyer and the market today, and that your brand rebranded is completely in alignment with the bigger picture.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. I believe we should have Wilbur up next.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I have the luxury of going third and getting to follow up on some awesome stuff that Bruce and Jennifer have already presented, and hopefully talk a little bit about a way to move forward and do some of those things, the leadership stuff and the great communication things that Bruce and Jennifer also reinforced. By way of very small introduction, I had about 32 years of time in the military, split between active duty Army and Army National Guard. Have had about 25 years in business. Had a chance to lead teams from as small as 5 through as large as about 12,500, doing leadership, planning, and communications in some really true crisis situations. And hopefully what we'll be able to give you today is a little bit of a wrap up on some of these things. I'll start with, not on the slide, but I'll start with our 3 top lessons learned through all of this stuff. And one, much like Bruce said, there is no replacement for effective leadership. It is the cornerstone of consistently exceptional performance from organizations. The second being that I'll differ a little bit with some of the phraseology from Jennifer. We find it is almost impossible to over communicate. I do understand that there are times when that can be too much, but in crisis and in regular leadership, err on the side of communicating more than less. And finally, planning is critically important, but the ability to execute that plan is what really makes the difference in the long run for organizations. So with that, next slide, please, Nora. All right, what's on the agenda? The why, or the call to action. I'm not going to spend much time on that because Jennifer and Bruce really covered those dynamics that are different from the day before coronavirus till the day after the coronavirus. We're going to talk a bit about the how. Going to cover a little bit of internal and external assessments, some continuity planning, and we're going to talk about a tool that we use known by the acronym MV OGSM T, and you can see what those stand for, and we'll highlight those a little bit later. Next slide, please. All right, so the why and the what. The why has been brilliantly covered by my fellow presenters, so thank you very much for teeing those things up. The bottom line is things are going to be different. But we've seen things be different in a number of ways over all of our careers, regardless whether that career spans 6 months or 60 years. We know that in this case, we're going to have to dynamically retask. We're going to have to dynamically reshape our thinking. And we also need to not forget that some things will go pretty much back to the way they were. And that is a comfort level for a lot of people. So consider that in all that we do. So the what piece of this is effective business planning. And in this case, it is specifically, as we term it, post-COVID emergence. So that period when we go back to things being a little bit more relaxed in terms of restrictions, and we can re-enter into what we consider a little bit more normal business operating environment. Next slide, please. Obviously, there's a lot more on these slides than we can cover, or that I can cover in 15 minutes. So possibly some of that will be for your digestion and use later. With regard to internal and external assessments, we think it's a great time for you to take another look back at yourselves internally and to take a look at what's changed in the environment externally. There are a lot of tools to be able to do that. It may be something you are very familiar with. It may be something that you haven't had to do before because you, as a leader, you as a company, didn't face these kind of crisis situations. But we use 2 tools very specifically for that. And if we can go to the next slide, please, we'll have a graphic representation. The first one on the left, the SWOT analysis, probably something that many of you are familiar with, and it is a tool that that we like to look at in terms of obviously covering the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and the threats. So when you do the SWOT, obviously this will be able to cover some internal things and some external things and give you a sense of where you stand as an organization. And my bet is that if you did one of these 6 months ago and you do one of these next week, the results of that SWOT will be dramatically different. Things will be significantly different. And as a result, that's going to drive your different ways of needing to move forward in the business. On the right-hand side, you see the one that is more traditionally known as a risk analysis tool. Some people call it an HVA, hazards and vulnerability analysis. But the bottom line to this is you're able to take a look at internally and externally those things that can risk your continued future success. And the cornerstone to all of this is being able to look at risks that are low to high probability and consequences that are low to high. And generally speaking, when we talk about implementing actions resulting from this assessment, we look at those things that are high probability and high consequence as the starting point for doing that. And then we work backwards in terms of the likelihood and severity of impact on your organization. So 2 tools to be able to do that internal and external assessment. Can I have the next slide, please? Continuity planning. Both of my fellow presenters covered pieces of this continuity planning, so I'm not going to dig into all of it. But the bottom line to the continuity planning is these are the things that will allow us to move forward smartly. Bruce gave a touching example of a senior leader, I assume maybe of a family-owned organization that died suddenly. And that is one of those key critical things that we try to avoid in any organization where there is any single point of failure in an organization. Generally speaking, when we do continuity planning across all kinds of factors and metrics, we like to use the rule of 3. And the rule of 3 means that for any key issue, action, task, responsibility, there are at least 3 people or 3 things able to execute those tasks. So we try to ask you to be 3 deep in any one of those capabilities moving forward. And you can see some of the additional recommendations there. The one I'm going to highlight on this slide before moving on is when we talk about delegation. We've worked with a lot of organizations, and obviously we learned this very much in our military experience as well. It is one thing to delegate responsibility. It is entirely different and entirely more critical to delegate authority when you delegate that responsibility. We see so many times when organizations delegate responsibility down the chain of command or across the breadth and depth of an organization, but what they don't do is they don't do the authorization for those actions along with it. So something critical to consider there. So next slide, please. A tool that we use for this is something known as PACE planning, or primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. So across all critical elements, key persons, equipment, and processes in an organization, we encourage you to use the PACE plan. Now, I said earlier the rule of 4, or excuse me, the rule of 3. This one's really a 4 deep look at it. But the primary being the normal person that does the task, the alternate being somebody who is fully trained, fully qualified and authorized, and who has regularly practiced those tasks. Contingency may be somebody who has been basically trained and has all the right skills and qualifications and authorizations, but doesn't practice a lot. And emergency really gets into the crisis situation, somewhat like we have faced for the last 6 or 8 weeks in the COVID. The ability for you as an organization to implement just-in-time training and or to modify your processes and procedures to be able to accommodate somebody doing these tasks in an emergency environment. All right, next slide, please. All right, so organizational strategic planning. Jennifer had some really great things to say about this on the way forward that she ended up her presentation with. So we break this down into 3 separate blocks when we do strategic planning. First one being mission and vision. It's the why. It's the raison d'etre. So we're able to look at why we exist as an organization. And I think in many cases, you're going to find organizations that have a different reason for existing the day after COVID than they did the day before COVID. The second piece to that being the strategy, defining the big picture and the pathway from where we are now to where we may be in the future, where we need to be in the future. We break that down into objectives, goals, strategies, and measures. Some of you are probably familiar with that tool. It's similar in some ways to things like balanced scorecard process. We develop from that a course of action that is typically a verbal and graphic depiction of that way from here to the future. Next slide, please. And this is an example of the OGSM. And there's 1,000 different ways you can put together this OGSM. But the bottom line is, nested on this a reflection of the mission and vision, typically the macro level goal, And then you get into the meat of it. You get into the objectives, and we break our objectives down into primarily a P-focused categorization, so priorities, people, processes, products, purchasers, provisions, places, and principles. And then we add on to that information. And as Jennifer had talked a lot about in her presentation, and Bruce had also, information being both that internal information to your organization and the information that is used externally to your stakeholders. So from that, we develop goals. So the objectives are words, and the goals are numbers focused. Then we get into strategies, which are ways to achieve those goals, strategies being words, and then we focus on the measures and metrics. So that's the way we break out the OGSM, and it's just a really nice way to organize your thoughts at the strategic level, and then we'll talk about how tactically to get some of that done. Next slide, please. All right, so the tactical action, in the end, it's the ability to execute, and the way we find best to be able to execute is breaking down things into executable tasks. And assigning those executable tasks to a single responsible owner may be done by a team, but one person responsible for it. And as most of us in the military become highly accustomed to, those tasks have conditions, standards, timelines, and deadlines associated with them. The tool that we use to be able to do that is something known as a synchronization matrix, also known as an execution matrix, commonly called in the non-military world as a project plan, or affectionately termed by us as a horse blanket, because sometimes it gets big and a little bit unwieldy and gets hung on a wall somewhere, and you think it really ought to be wrapped around the back of a horse. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is a visual example of a not completed horse blanket or sync matrix. But the bottom line to this is using what we term lines of effort, the vertical column. You'll see that we fill in the responsible entities, and then across time, much like Jennifer had just talked about breaking things down into manageable chunks of time, we look at near term, mid-term, and long-term in terms of what we're going to focus on in terms of those tactical efforts across time. The beauty to a completed product like this is that everybody in the organization can have a good visibility on where they are, what their responsibilities are, and how those responsibilities link across time and related in lines of effort to the other individuals in the organization. And next slide, please. So in about the 30 seconds or so that I have left in my time block, just a real quick reinforcement on something that my fellow presenters have already said, and that Mantech really stands for, is that they take the time, make the time to plan now. There's never an ideal time for planning, quite frankly. You'll never have enough. So just make the commitment, sit down, circle up that group of close advisors and confidants that Bruce talked about. If you don't have that right circle of confidants and close advisors, bring them in. A word of caution on that: don't make that circle everybody who thinks exactly like you do. Consider the ability to have a diverse set of knowledge, skills, input, perspectives, and perceptions into that set of advisors, because things will be a little bit different moving forward out of this crisis than they were coming in. If you have not done solid continuity planning before, find a way to do it now. This will not be the last crisis that we face. And then the bottom bullet there, I think, as I say on the slide, a little bit of a shameless pitch for all of us and for what Mantech does, those very valuable services that they deliver. Sometimes doing some of this stuff is easier when you have a partner who's not directly part of your organization. Somebody you can bring in that you can learn to trust and rely on, but who can bring a different perspective, a different set of those knowledge, skills, and experience to your table for a short term or a long term to be able to help you through this crisis period. And if we can do any of that moving forward, I think, speaking on behalf of all of us, we'd be very happy to be able to step in and be a short or long-term business partner with you. And I think with that, I think I'll turn things back over to our good friends at Mantech.
Thanks, Wilbur. That was like the best pitch ever for Mantech's value. That's more than just the three of them, which were amazing today. So thank you, Bruce, Jennifer, and Wilbur. But we do have all those connections to make on all third-party providers. So again, thank you for joining us and the insights. Oh, I'm sorry, we have question and answers. Does anyone have a question? I did not see any on chat. Does anyone want to be brave enough to answer Bruce's question on what of the 9 areas that you may need to be doing a little bit better on? Just in general. It's the sad part of webinars. We can't just look them in the eye, but all right. Well, I greatly appreciate everyone's time. And
Leanne?
Leanne?
yes.
I don't have a question, but I just have a comment that, we're reacting now to, the crisis of COVID, but these principles are applicable when you consider how quickly business has changed. These strategies will work, 5 years from now when there is no crisis.
Absolutely. And I think all of them kind of touched on that level, but if you have the time and, well, if you're willing to invest now, it's going to pay dividends in the future. I certainly want us to go through a crisis like this again, but we don't know what's going to happen. So certainly taking advantage of learning from this experience and applying it for the future will pay dividends.
Hey, Bruce, this is Wilbur. Where do you start coaching somebody through those 9 when they are at a high level of anxiety like now? Or maybe say that the organizational transition point where you got a brand new young leader who is replacing a paternal icon?
I didn't know that the presenters could ask the presenters questions, but that's a fair question. It's a good one, Wilbur. I think you start with, okay, what is the person's leadership role and what responsibilities go with that? And what do they already bring with them? Because if you look at that list of 9 qualities or tactics that I presented, there's very likely whoever stepping into a leadership role already has some of those things in place, but may need to have some help with others. So I would ask them to think about, okay, where are you competent now? Where do you need to develop competency? Very likely whoever placed them in that leadership role or others that know them well can give them some feedback in areas they're either already very good at and areas they might need to hone. So those would be some thoughts. As we know, when we talk about a crisis, it's a rainy day today. So, we can all prepare like, oh, I can lead fine when it's a sunny day and everything's going well. But as we all know, some people who are what I would call a mediocre leader actually shine in a crisis. For whatever reason, they have some unknown or hidden talent that just comes out. And the opposite is also true. I've seen leaders who do well when conditions are going according to plan, but when they're not, they panic, and then, of course, others panic around them. So I think a leader has to be prepared, as you touched on, I think, Wilbur, to lead under different conditions. Sometimes it's status quo and sometimes it's not. So I hope I answered your question. Those are a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Appreciate it.
Oh, we got one on chat. How can an organization position itself to our new normal while at the same time being nimble enough to react to what could be a sudden change? I think that's a Wilbur or Bruce question, maybe.
So could you read that one again, please, Leanne?
Yep, it's on the chat, but how can an organization position itself for our new normal while at the same time being nimble enough to react to what could be sudden change?
Yeah, I can take that one if you want. Thanks. Yeah, I had to put my glasses on to be able to see that chat thing. It's a delicate balancing act these days. I think one of those things actually goes back to some of the things that Bruce and Jennifer also talked about, and that's knowing yourself very, very well. So you're starting with, your capabilities, your current operating environment, and you know that to get from today to tomorrow, you're going to have to be able to continue to do those things. But looking forward, you need to be able to dynamically retask. So your ability to be resilient in the face of those challenges is important, but your ability to rapidly be able to retask to that new changing environment becomes critical. One of those things you get out of strategic planning, we think, is some of those things. One of those things that you get by being able to look at a multifaceted communications plan, or as we would affectionately term it, information operations. I know there's some less than favorable views of that term. That is important. So that ability to dynamically look at the future while still continuing to execute those key critical short-term tasks is very, very important. And whoever asked that question, be glad to take a follow-up if that did not meet the answer.
If I may, I also like some things Jennifer said about using this time now to pause and look in the mirror, so to speak, and to that question that was asked. What are some things we're doing now that we want to continue? What are some things we may have to be nimble on and change as we come out of this, knowing that no one has a crystal ball? Wilbur mentioned strategic planning. A lot of times when I've been involved in strategic planning, it's based on a set of assumptions. And those assumptions can suddenly change, as we've all been experiencing. So really good organizations, when Wilbur mentioned contingency planning, they operate on a set of assumptions, but they also ask the questions, what are those conditions change? And I have some clients that will do the contingency, or what we sometimes call scenario planning. What if condition A changes or condition B? And some of them even run they'll run hot sites. How do we operate remotely if we can't operate from our main site? Or they run shock tests on their systems to make sure that they have redundancies and things built in so that there isn't that single point of failure, as Wilbur touched on.
I'd like to add that part of being nimble or being agile is also having a regular understanding of the clients, of your target audiences and the competitors. And I talked about that. We make sure that our clients for whom we're strategically engaged have a regular process for assessing competitors and audiences, whether that's annually or even quarterly, depending on what the nature of their business is. So once you've built the foundational information and the profiles of those other parties, you've got a process in place to help you reassess very quickly, and that helps keep you nimble.
Excellent. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we'll be good to go. So thank you again, Bruce, Jennifer, and Wilbur, for those insights. It was great to be able to hear all of you, those that were on Tuesday. This call, that it was definitely leading us through how we can all be better prepared going forward in the future. Our May sessions that we're going to be holding on webinar for the Manufacturing Matters series are going to be on the topics of OSHA and cybersecurity. Those details are going to be provided on Monday when we have an even bigger announcement that has been months in the making, and it's a little clue. Jennifer spoke about it, so we're very excited about Monday's announcement, so stay tuned for that. And with that, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you virtually soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
Good
very
session.
much. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Kudos.